The inheritance clause. The grandfather clock in the hall, a behemoth of dark oak and brass that had ticked through 50 years of family Christmases, birthday parties, and quiet Sunday afternoons, struck 3. Its deep, resonant chime usually comforted Maggie Delaney. Today it felt like a countdown. She sat in her favorite wingback chair by the bay window, a cashmere throw over her knees, pretending to read a novel. The house, a sprawling old-money Tudor in the heart of Boston's Back Bay, was silent except for the clock's echo and the distant, muffled sounds of an argument coming from her late husband's study. They thought she was napping. They thought she was old, her hearing going, her mind soft. At 78, Maggie was happy to let them think it. It was, she had learned, a form of camouflage. The voices grew louder, sharper, piercing the studied quiet of the home she had built. Absolutely not, Sarah. You got the Cape Cod house. The Back Bay property is mine. It's only fair. That was Michael, her eldest. A corporate lawyer whose empathy had been surgically removed. She was convinced, along with his tonsils at age 10. Fair. Sarah's voice, usually a cultured purr, was a screech. You've been leeching off Mom for years with your business investments that never pan out. I've been the one taking her to doctor's appointments. And whose fault is that? You chose to stay local. I built a life in New York. A third voice, colder, more analytical, cut through the squabble. The emotional blackmail is tiresome, Sarah. The objective fact is that the trust's liquidity is paramount. The house should be sold, and the assets divided equally. My firm can manage the portfolio far more effectively than either of you ever could. Elizabeth, her youngest, a hedge fund manager who viewed human relationships as mergers and acquisitions, and her family as a poorly performing asset she was poised to restructure. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. They weren't just arguing about things. They were dividing her life, her history, while she was still breathing in the very next room. Then came the words that turned her blood to ice. The guardianship is the priority, Elizabeth stated, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone that Maggie had to strain to hear. Once Dr. Evans submits his report, the court will have no choice. She's clearly not competent. Did you see the state of her checkbook? She donated $50,000 to the public library. Michael sighed, a sound of profound irritation. A moment of sentimentality we can't afford. We need control, people. Unified control. Once we have the power of attorney and the guardianship, we can liquidate everything, put her in a nice facility, and manage the estate properly. A nice facility. Her beautiful, life-filled home reduced to an asset. Her freedom to a guardianship. Her children, her 3 beloved children, were not just vultures circling. They were the ones sharpening the knives. Maggie sat motionless as the truth washed over her, not in a hot wave of anger, but in a cold, slow tide of absolute devastation. She had spent her life as the peacemaker, the glue. After Arthur died, her money had become the substitute for love, the balm she applied to every familial wound. A check for Michael's failing startup. A trust fund for Sarah's children's exorbitant private schools. A loan for Elizabeth's 3rd divorce settlement. She had paid for their loyalty, and now the bill had come due. They were foreclosing. The study door opened. Their voices instantly shifted, becoming cloying and sweet. Mom, you're awake. We were just discussing some investments. Can we get you some tea, Mother? You look pale. They fussed over her, their faces masks of loving concern. Michael adjusted her blanket. Sarah felt her forehead for a fever. Elizabeth straightened a painting on the wall, her eyes critically assessing its value. Maggie looked at them, these strangers she had raised, and saw only the cold calculation behind their eyes. The desire for her affection was gone. All that remained was the desire for her money. She smiled, a frail, watery thing. Just a little tired, my darlings. Don't worry about me. They left eventually, with promises to call tomorrow, with kisses on her cheek that felt like the brush of a spider's leg. The heavy front door closed, and the house was silent once more, save for the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock. Maggie did not cry. She stood, letting the cashmere throw fall to the floor, and walked to Arthur's study. She ignored the lingering scent of their ambition and their expensive colognes. She went to his old, solid mahogany desk, opened a drawer, and took out a business card, yellowed with age. It was for a lawyer, Liam O'Connell, a man Arthur had once called the most ruthlessly ethical son of a bitch I've ever met. He specialized in estate law. The next morning she called him. His office was in a modern high-rise, all glass and steel, a world away from her dusty, book-lined study. Liam O'Connell was a man in his 60s with a fighter's hands and the tired, keen eyes of someone who had seen the very worst of human nature play out in probate court. "Mrs. Delaney," he said, after she had laid out the entire sordid story without a single tear. She presented it like a case, cold and clean. The overheard conversation, the planned guardianship, the decades of financial support, the utter, soul-crushing betrayal. He steepled his fingers. "We can fight the guardianship. We have an excellent case, especially with your mental faculties clearly intact." "No," Maggie said, her voice quiet but firm as titanium. O'Connell raised an eyebrow. Fighting them would be playing their game on their battlefield. It would be messy, public, and ultimately, it would still be about the money. She leaned forward, her eyes, the same sharp blue that had once charmed senators and CEOs, locking with his. "I don't want to stop them from getting my money, Mr. O'Connell. I want to make them earn it. And in the process, I want to force them to look in the mirror they've been avoiding their entire lives." A slow, grim smile spread across O'Connell's face. He saw it now, the steel beneath the cashmere. "What did you have in mind?" "I want to rewrite my will. I want you to help me design a lesson, the ultimate lesson from the grave. I want clauses, Mr. O'Connell, not to grant an inheritance, but to offer the possibility of one, contingent on them proving they are capable of being something more than avaricious parasites." For the next 2 hours they crafted the weapon. It was a thing of brutal, beautiful legal genius. The last will and testament of Margaret Delaney would not be a simple distribution of assets. It would be a gauntlet. When Maggie returned home, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since Arthur's death. She was no longer a victim. She was the architect of their reckoning. She began to watch them, not with a mother's hopeful eye, but with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a failed experiment. She saw Michael's greed, Sarah's venomous entitlement, Elizabeth's cold superiority. And she saw the others too. Her grandson Jason, a 22-year-old influencer, whose world existed entirely on a screen. Her 2 granddaughters, Michael's daughters, who hadn't spoken to each other in 3 years over a stolen boyfriend. They were all broken in their own ways. And she had helped break them with her money, her placating, her desperate need for harmony. The formal reading of the will, held in O'Connell's sterile conference room a month after Maggie's peaceful passing in her sleep, was a spectacle of barely contained anticipation. Michael, Sarah, and Elizabeth sat on one side of the polished table, their spouses and children behind them, a united front of grief that didn't reach their eyes. Liam O'Connell, without ceremony, began to read. The first part was standard. Small, generous bequests to her loyal housekeeper, the Boston Public Library, and the local animal shelter. A ripple of impatience went through the family. Then, he reached the core of the document. "The remainder of my estate, including all real property, financial holdings and personal assets, valued at approximately $78 million, shall be placed in a trust," O'Connell read, his voice flat and clear. Heads nodded. This was what they were waiting for. "The distribution of these assets is contingent upon the successful completion of several conditions by my heirs, specifically my children, Michael, Sarah, and Elizabeth Delaney, and my grandson Jason Miller." The room went still. "Condition 1, O'Connell continued, as if discussing the weather. "Michael and Sarah Delaney shall jointly manage and operate the Harbor Light, a small, struggling bookstore in Rockport, Maine, which I have purchased posthumously through the trust. They must do so for a period of 12 consecutive months. The business must, at the end of this period, show a net profit of at least $1. They must work in the store a minimum of 30 hours per week each. They may not hire a manager to fulfill this duty. Failure of either party to participate fully, or any attempt to sabotage the other, will result in the immediate and permanent disinheritance of both. Michael's jaw dropped. Sarah's face turned a mottled crimson. They hadn't spoken a civil word to each other in 5 years. Condition 2. O'Connell went on relentless. Elizabeth Delaney must resign from her current position and complete 12 consecutive months of full-time, hands-on humanitarian service with an approved organization outside the United States. She may not use any personal wealth or technology beyond a basic mobile phone for communication. Her performance will be evaluated by the organization's director. Failure to complete this service, or any attempt to leverage her position for personal or professional gain, will result in her immediate and permanent disinheritance. Elizabeth looked as if she'd been slapped. Humanitarian service. Hands-on. Condition 3. Jason Miller must completely disconnect from all social media platforms and the internet for 12 consecutive months. He will then complete a year of service with the same organization as his aunt, Elizabeth. He will document his experience through a written journal, to be submitted to the trust. A single post, tweet, or uploaded photo during this period will void his inheritance entirely. Jason, who had been live streaming the reading from his phone until his father snatched it away, looked physically ill. And finally, O'Connell said, letting the word hang in the stunned silence. Before a single dollar is distributed, all primary beneficiaries, Michael, Sarah, Elizabeth, and Jason, must undergo and pass a series of psychological evaluations, administered by a trust-appointed psychiatrist, to assess for what the document terms chronic acquired entitlement disorder. Failure to participate in good faith, or a result that indicates a pathological level of entitlement, will be grounds for disinheritance. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of the legal document in O'Connell's hands. Michael was the first to find his voice. This is insane. This is punitive. She can't do this. Oh, she can and she has, O'Connell replied mildly. The will is ironclad. It was witnessed and notarized weeks after her competency was confirmed by 3 independent psychiatrists. You are of course free to challenge it. I would estimate the legal fees to be in the millions, with a probability of success near 0. He placed the document on the table. The clock starts now, he said. You have 1 week to decide if you want to play your mother's game. The choice, as she intended, is entirely yours. He left them then, sitting in the wreckage of their expectations. The inheritance was no longer a gift. It was a test. And for the first time in their privileged, entitled lives, Michael, Sarah, Elizabeth, and Jason were going to have to prove their worth. From somewhere beyond the grave, Maggie Delaney was finally getting the last word. The gauntlet thrown. The week that followed the will reading was a silent war conducted in separate corners of the city. Text threads that had once buzzed with veiled insults and strategic alliances fell dead. The Delaney siblings were each grappling with the same horrifying reality. Their mother had outmaneuvered them from beyond the grave. Michael, in his high-rise office with its panoramic views of Boston Harbor, stared at a spreadsheet. $78 million. It was a number that had dictated his life's trajectory, a finish line he'd been sprinting towards since he understood its meaning. And now it was locked behind the one thing he found most repulsive: collaboration with his sister Sarah. Bookstore. Maine. The absurdity was a physical ache. He picked up the phone, his first instinct always to call his lawyer to fight. But O'Connell's words echoed in his mind. Probability of success near 0. He slammed the phone down. She had trapped him. Across town, Sarah was in her impeccably decorated Newton home, weeping with a fury that scared her own children. It wasn't just the money, though God knew she needed it. It was the insult. To be forced into partnership with Michael, who had always treated her with condescending amusement, as if her life as a mother and community volunteer was a charming, trivial hobby. A bookstore. She hadn't worked a day in 20 years. The humiliation was a hot coal in her chest. Her husband, Tim, a gentle, ineffectual man, tried to rub her shoulders. "Maybe it won't be so bad, honey." She shrugged him off with a snarl. Elizabeth's reaction was one of cold, disbelieving fury. She sat in her minimalist apartment, the silence a stark contrast to the roaring trading floor she commanded. Humanitarian service. It was a phrase so foreign it was almost comical. It meant dirt, disease, and stupidity. It meant a year of her life, the most valuable commodity she knew, wasted. She calculated the opportunity cost in her head, the commissions lost, the promotions missed, and the number was so staggering it made her feel faint. Resign. It was professional suicide. She immediately began researching legal loopholes, her mind, a precision instrument for financial exploitation, searching for a flaw in her mother's design. And Jason, the grandson, was in a state of existential panic. A year without the internet. It was like being told to go a year without oxygen. His entire identity, his friendships, his source of income. His life was curated online. The real world was just a dull, low-resolution place he had to pass through occasionally. He pleaded with his parents, with his aunts, to fight the will. "She can't do this. It's cruel and unusual punishment." They were too absorbed in their own catastrophes to listen. On the 7th day, the silence broke. It was Michael who cracked first. The pressure of his own financial over-leverage, the second mortgage, the margin calls on his investments, was too great. He called Sarah. "We don't have a choice," he said. His voice stripped of its usual lawyerly confidence, sounding merely tired. "I'd rather burn the money," Sarah spat back. "You might get your wish. We have to go to Maine this week. O'Connell's people are setting up a meeting with the current owner." Long venomous silence. "Fine." Their first visit to the Harbor Light was a study in mutual contempt. The drive up to Rockport was spent in silence, the beautiful coastal scenery lost on them. The bookstore itself was exactly as depressing as Michael had feared. A cramped, musty space tucked away on a side street, smelling of old paper and mildew. The shelves were sparsely populated, the carpet was worn thin, and a single, elderly customer browsed the poetry section. Annette, the septuagenarian owner who was desperate to retire, showed them the ledgers. The numbers were a bloodbath. "It's a community institution," Annette said, her eyes pleading. "It just needs fresh energy." Michael saw a money pit. Sarah saw a prison. Their first joint management meeting, held at a sticky table in a nearby diner, was a disaster. "We need to modernize," Michael declared, pulling out his laptop. "E-commerce, an aggressive social media campaign. We'll liquidate this deadweight inventory and pivot to high-margin gift items. And destroy the soul of the place." Sarah shot back. "This isn't one of your corporate raiding projects, Michael. It's a bookstore. We need to host events, book clubs, children's story hours. Build a community." "Community doesn't pay the rent, Sarah. Profit does. The clause specifies a profit. It also specifies we have to run it, not strip it for parts like a stolen car." They argued for an hour, their voices rising, drawing stares from the locals. It was a perfect microcosm of their entire relationship. Michael's cold capitalism versus Sarah's sentimental, impractical idealism. They left the diner with nothing decided, the chasm between them wider than ever. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had exhausted her legal options. Her own attorney, one of the best in the city, had confirmed O'Connell's assessment. The will was bulletproof. Faced with the binary choice, a year of degradation or permanent poverty, she made the only calculation she could. She walked into her boss's office and resigned. The news sent shockwaves through the financial district. The official story was a sabbatical for personal growth. The unofficial rumor was a nervous breakdown. A trust-appointed caseworker presented her with a list of approved organizations. She chose one almost at random, a small NGO building schools and digging wells in a rural, impoverished region of Malawi. It seemed the furthest thing possible from her life in Boston, and therefore, she reasoned, the one most likely to satisfy the clause's puritanical requirements. Her preparation was as clinical as a military operation. She got every recommended vaccination, packed functional, durable clothing, and read the briefing materials with a detached efficiency. She felt nothing but a simmering resentment. She was not going to find herself. She was going to endure. Jason's disconnection was the most publicly dramatic. His digital suicide was a curated event in itself. He posted a tearful dramatic video to his hundreds of thousands of followers, announcing his forced year-long social media detox, due to a toxic family situation. He played the victim perfectly, garnering a wave of sympathetic comments and likes, the last hit of validation he would get for a very long time. When he finally powered down his phone, the silence that descended was terrifying. He sat in his room, staring at the blank screen, feeling a profound emptiness he didn't have a filter for. The game was afoot. In a dusty bookstore in Maine, a sister and brother waged a cold war. In a departure lounge at Logan Airport, a woman in tactical gear prepared for a war of attrition against dirt and inconvenience. And in a suburban bedroom, a young man faced the terrifying prospect of his own uncurated thoughts. From her elegant silent house in Back Bay, Maggie Delaney's spirit watched it all unfold. She had thrown a stone into the stagnant pond of her family's life, and the ripples were just beginning to spread. The first, fragile cracks were about to appear in their armored selves. The gauntlet had been thrown, and the long, painful, and ultimately necessary unraveling had begun. Cracks in the armor. The first month at the Harbor Light was a masterclass in mutual sabotage. Michael and Sarah operated the bookstore like a partitioned country. He commandeered the back office, spending hours on his laptop, ordering inventory based on algorithms and sales data, ignoring the specific literary character of the shop. He stacked the front tables with generic bestsellers and garish self-help books that Annette, the former owner, would have never allowed past the door. Sarah, in retaliation, took charge of the front. She would misplace Michael's new shipments, forget to restock his bestsellers, and instead, curated cozy nooks with obscure poetry and literary fiction. She started a weekly children's story hour, which consisted of her reading to 3 bored toddlers while their mothers scrolled on their phones. The cacophony of wailing children and Sarah's theatrically soothing voice drove Michael to wear noise-canceling headphones. Their interactions were clipped, transactional, and laced with venom. "You're going to bankrupt us with your twee little fantasies," Michael snapped one afternoon, pointing at a stack of expensive, illustrated fairy tales Sarah had ordered. "And you're going to turn this place into a airport newsstand with your soul-crushing pragmatism," she shot back. The only thing they agreed on was their shared loathing for their mother. Maggie Delaney was the ghost in the room, her portrait, which Sarah had hung behind the counter, smiling down at their misery. But a strange thing began to happen in the second month. A local book club, comprised of a dozen sharp, retired women, discovered the store. They were unimpressed with Michael's bestsellers and charmed by Sarah's literary passion. They started spending money. Not a lot but consistently. One of them, a former accountant named Beatrice, even offered some unsolicited advice. "You know," she said to Michael, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on his computer screen, "your data is good, but it's missing the local context. People here don't want the same thing they can get on Amazon. They want a reason to come in." She then turned to Sarah. "And your taste is exquisite, dear, but you can't pay the electric bill with sonnets. You need a bridge." Beatrice, it turned out, became their unofficial, unpaid consultant. She forced them to sit down together. Grudgingly, they listened. Michael's data identified a gap in the local market for regional history and maritime books. Sarah's charm and connections found local authors to host signings. They started a blind date with a book program, wrapping random books in brown paper with only a few keywords as clues. It was a hit. They weren't friends. They still grated on each other's every nerve. But a fragile professional détente was forming, built on a foundation of mutual desperation and Beatrice's no-nonsense mediation. They were learning, for the first time in their lives, to compromise. In Malawi, Elizabeth's war was not against her siblings, but against reality itself. Her arrival was a catastrophe. She was housed in a simple concrete block building with a corrugated tin roof. There was no air conditioning, intermittent electricity, and the water was drawn from a well. The heat was a physical weight. The dust coated everything. Her first task was to help mix concrete for a new schoolhouse. She, who commanded millions with a phone call, stood in the sweltering heat, stirring gravel and sand with a shovel, her hands blistering, her designer sunglasses doing little to shield her from the relentless sun. The local foreman, a patient man named Joseph, tried to show her the technique. She was terrible at it. The other volunteers, mostly idealistic college students, watched her with a mixture of pity and amusement. She tried to manage the project to optimize the workflow. She created spreadsheets and efficiency charts. Joseph would nod politely and then continue with the methodical, time-tested rhythm of the village. Her spreadsheets were useless. Her arrogance was a liability. The breaking point came during a well-digging project. She was assigned to hand out water to the workers. It was menial, boring, and beneath her. A young boy, no more than 6, came up to her. He was barefoot, his clothes were ragged, but his eyes were bright and curious. He pointed at her water bottle. She handed it to him. He drank deeply, then gave her a smile of such pure, uncomplicated gratitude that it felt like a physical blow. It was the first genuine, non-transactional human interaction she'd had in years. No one wanted anything from her. There was no deal to be made. Just a thirsty child and a drink of water. That night, lying on her cot under a mosquito net, listening to the chorus of insects, something cracked. The meticulously constructed fortress of her cynicism developed a fissure. She wasn't just enduring anymore. She was, against her will, beginning to see. For Jason, the silence was deafening. The first few weeks were a withdrawal worse than any drug. He was jumpy, anxious, and bored in a way he didn't know was possible. He tried to fill the void with video games, but the thrill was hollow without the prospect of streaming his victories. He went for walks, but the world felt flat and uninteresting without a filter to apply, without an audience to perform for. His mother, Sarah, desperate for a distraction from her own problems in Maine, had insisted he get a job. The trust allowed for it, as long as it wasn't online. He was hired as a stock boy at a local grocery store. It was mind-numbing. He stacked cans, swept floors, and dealt with grumpy customers. One afternoon, an elderly man, a regular, had trouble reaching an item on a high shelf. Jason, tall and lanky, got it for him. "Thanks, son," the man said, his voice raspy. "You're new. What's your name?" "Jason." "I'm Frank. You seem like a bright kid. What are you doing working here?" The question stunned Jason. No one had ever asked him what he was doing with his life. They only asked about his follower count, his engagement rate. He had no answer. He mumbled something about a gap year. Frank just nodded. "Well, it's good to use your hands. Reminds you've got a body, not just a brain floating in a jar." The comment stuck with Jason. He started noticing things. The rhythm of the store, the personalities of the other employees, the small dramas that played out in the aisles. He started talking to Frank during his breaks. Frank was a retired mechanic, a widower. He talked about fixing engines, about his wife, about the way the city had changed. He spoke in stories, not in status updates. For the first time, Jason was having conversations that weren't performative. He wasn't crafting a persona. He was just listening. And in the quiet space left by the absence of notifications, he began to hear the faint, unfamiliar sound of his own thoughts. He was lonely, yes, but he was also, strangely, starting to feel real. 3 months in, the first crack in the family's unified front appeared. It was Sarah who broke the communication embargo. She called Elizabeth's satellite phone, her voice trembling with the emotion she couldn't name. Elizabeth. It's Sarah. A long pause filled with static. Sarah. Is everything all right? I don't know. This bookstore, it's hard. Michael is impossible. But we had 16 people in for an author event last night. 16. And they bought books. Actual books. Elizabeth, sitting in the dark in Malawi, thousands of miles away, listened. She heard the exhaustion and the faint, fragile pride in her sister's voice. It was a tone she'd never heard before. That's good, Sarah, Elizabeth said, her own voice softer than usual, stripped of its defensive edge. How is it there? Sarah asked tentatively. Elizabeth looked out at the vast, star-filled African sky, so much brighter than any she'd ever seen in Boston. It's difficult, she said, and for the first time it wasn't a complaint. It was a confession. I mixed concrete today. My back aches. A shared, weary laugh crackled over the line. It was small and it was strained, but it was a connection. For a few minutes, they weren't rivals for a fortune. They were just two sisters in over their heads, talking about their aches and pains. When they hung up, the silence in both their locations felt different. Less empty. The gauntlet Maggie had thrown down was not just breaking them. It was slowly, painfully beginning to remake them. The mirror held up. The 6th month marked a turning point, a subtle but undeniable shift from sheer survival to something resembling engagement. The changes were no longer just external actions. They were beginning to seep into the cracks of their identities. At the harbor light, Michael and Sarah had achieved an uneasy, efficient truce. They still bickered, but it was the bickering of partners, not enemies. They had a shared whiteboard in the back office, a battleground that had become a collaboration space. Michael's data-driven orders were balanced by Sarah's community-focused events. The blind date with a book had become so popular they had to hire a high school student, Chloe, to help with the wrapping. The real test came when a national bookstore chain announced it was opening a branch just 10 minutes away. The news felt like a death sentence. The old Michael would have immediately begun plotting a cutthroat competitive strategy. The old Sarah would have wept and declared it a lost cause. Instead, they found themselves sitting at the same sticky diner booth, a sense of grim solidarity between them. They'll have cheaper prices. A bigger selection, Michael stated, staring into his coffee. But they won't have us, Sarah replied, and the statement was so uncharacteristically fierce that Michael looked up. They won't have Beatrice's book club. They won't have Chloe, who remembers every customer's name and what their kids like to read. They won't have our story hours. It was Michael who, after a long silence, proposed the unthinkable. What if we lean into it? We can't compete on price. So we compete on what they can't replicate. Us. They spent the next week working later than they ever had, fueled by a shared, defiant energy. Michael used his legal expertise to navigate the bureaucracy of hosting small, licensed wine and cheese evenings for author events. Sarah used her social connections to get a local minor celebrity chef to do a cookbook signing. They rebranded the store not as a place to buy books, but as the literary heart of Rockport. The day the chain store opened, they held their breath. Their sales dipped, but not catastrophically. And then, a week later, something remarkable happened. Their regulars came back, many of them expressing how much they preferred the personal, cozy atmosphere of the harbor light. They had chosen community over convenience. For the first time, Michael and Sarah felt a flicker of pride that had nothing to do with their mother's money. They had built something. Together. In Malawi, Elizabeth was no longer just enduring. She was, to her own astonishment, learning. The breaking point had been the well project. After weeks of back-breaking labor, the day came when fresh, clean water finally gushed from the ground. The village erupted in celebration. Children danced, women sang, and old men clapped her on the back, their faces wreathed in smiles. Joseph, the foreman, handed her the first cup. "You earned this, Liz." Liz. No one had ever called her that. It was the name of a person who got her hands dirty, not a hedge fund manager named Elizabeth. As she drank the cool, clear water, a profound sense of accomplishment washed over her, more satisfying than any multi-million-dollar deal she had ever closed. It was tangible. It was real. She stopped trying to optimize and started to listen. She learned a few phrases of the local language. She helped the village women set up a small, communal vegetable garden, applying her knowledge of resource allocation to something that actually mattered. The disdain she had arrived with had been replaced by a deep, humbling respect. The backward way of life she had once scorned now revealed a complex wisdom she was only beginning to understand. She still thought about money, about power. But the thoughts were different now. They were no longer about accumulation but about application. With the resources I have, she found herself thinking one night, I could fund a dozen of these wells. I could build a real school, not just a single classroom. The ambition was still there, but its target had shifted. The mirror her mother had held up was showing her a reflection she no longer recognized, but one she was starting to prefer. For Jason, the grocery store had become a surprising sanctuary. The mindless work had given way to a quiet competence. He knew the inventory by heart. He could predict Frank's shopping list. He'd even started a small, unofficial program where he would set aside slightly damaged produce for a local homeless shelter, something he'd learned from Frank. His journal, which he'd begun with resentful, sparse entries, was now filling up. He wrote about Frank's stories. He wrote about the frustration of a difficult customer and the small triumph of calming her down. He wrote about the simple pleasure of feeling physically tired from honest work. He was discovering a narrative of his own life, one that wasn't measured in likes, but in small, accumulated moments of connection and competence. His old friends had stopped calling. The world of influencers had moved on without him. At first, this had felt like a death. Now it felt like a liberation. He was no longer Jason Miller, influencer. He was just Jason. And just Jason, he was discovering, was a more interesting and complex person than he had ever allowed himself to be. The family's second communication was initiated by Elizabeth. She called the bookstore. Michael answered. Michael, it's Elizabeth. Elizabeth is everything. I'm fine, she cut him off, her voice calm. I need you to do something for me. Legally. Michael's lawyerly instincts kicked in. What is it? I want to set up a charitable foundation. From my personal funds. To fund well digging and school building projects in rural communities. I need you to handle the paperwork. The request was so utterly unexpected that Michael was speechless. This was not the Elizabeth he knew. The Elizabeth he knew only set up foundations for tax breaks. Are you serious? Deadly serious, she replied. The model here is inefficient. They're reliant on unpredictable foreign aid. I want to create a sustainable, revolving fund. It's a better investment in the long run. She was still using the language of finance, but the purpose had been utterly transformed. Michael, for the first time in his life, felt a surge of pride for his little sister. I can do that, he said. I'll get started right away. Thank you, Elizabeth said, and the gratitude in her voice was genuine. How is the bookstore? A small smile touched Michael's lips. We're holding our own. When he hung up, he walked out to the front of the store where Sarah was helping a customer. He waited until she was finished. That was Elizabeth, he said. She wants me to set up a charity for her. For wells. In Africa. Sarah stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then a slow, real smile spread across her face, the first one Michael had seen directed at him in years. Well, I'll be damned, she whispered. It's working. Mom's crazy plan is actually working. They stood there for a moment, in the quiet of the bookstore they had built together, surrounded by the stories that had somehow started to change their own. The inheritance was no longer the goal. It had become the byproduct. The real prize was the people they were becoming, and the fragile, miraculous bridge they were building back to each other. The reckoning. The final 3 months of the year-long gauntlet were not a sprint to the finish line, but a slow, deliberate walk toward an unforeseen destination. The family was no longer just going through the motions. They were living them, and the motions had begun to live in them. At the Harbor Light, Michael and Sarah had become a surprisingly effective, if still occasionally prickly, team. The threat of the chain store had bonded them. They now held weekly strategy meetings that were more collaborative than combative. Michael had even started reading some of the novels Sarah championed, initially to better understand the inventory, but he found himself, to his own surprise, getting drawn into the stories. Sarah, in turn, had developed a grudging respect for Michael's financial acumen. His restructuring of their supplier contracts had saved the business from a cash flow crisis. The moment of true reckoning between them came on a cold, blustery day in March. A frail, elderly woman came in, looking for a specific, out-of-print collection of poetry. Sarah knew they didn't have it. The old Michael would have shrugged and suggested she try Amazon. But this Michael saw something else, a chance. "Let me make a few calls," he told the woman. For the next 2 days, he used his network of contacts, calling in favors from old colleagues and book scouts. He finally tracked down a copy from a specialty dealer in London. When he presented the beautifully wrapped book to the woman, her eyes filled with tears. She wasn't just a customer, she was a person. And Michael Delaney, for the first time in his adult life, had helped someone with no prospect of a return on his investment. The feeling was foreign and profoundly satisfying. He caught Sarah watching him, and her smile held no mockery, only a quiet, shared understanding. In Malawi, Elizabeth, Liz, to everyone in the village now, was overseeing the final touches on the schoolhouse. Her foundation, expertly set up by Michael, was already funding 2 new projects in neighboring villages. But her real transformation was more personal. She had learned to sit in silence, to listen to the rhythms of the land and the people. The relentless drive that had defined her was still there, but it had been tempered, humanized. The final test came when a sudden violent storm swept through the region, damaging several homes. The old Elizabeth would have calculated the economic loss. The new Liz worked alongside Joseph and the others through the night, hauling debris, securing tarps, and comforting frightened children. As she sat in the mud, exhausted, handing a crying toddler a piece of fruit, she felt a sense of belonging that no corner office had ever given her. She wasn't here to save them. She was here with them. The distinction was everything. Jason's journal was now a thick, worn notebook. His year of silence had given him a voice. He had started writing short stories, fictionalized accounts of the people he met at the grocery store. Frank, the retired mechanic, was his first and most devoted reader. "You've got a knack for this, kid," Frank said one afternoon, handing the journal back. "You see people. Really see 'em." For his final project, Jason, with Frank's encouragement, volunteered at the homeless shelter where he'd been sending the damaged produce. He helped serve meals and, tentatively at first, began talking to the residents. He heard stories of loss, addiction, and bad luck that shattered his privileged worldview. He wrote them down not for likes but for witness. The influencer was gone, replaced by a chronicler of unseen lives. The final entry in his journal was not about his own journey, but a poignant character sketch of a man named Leo who had once been a concert pianist. It was the best thing he had ever written. The day of the final evaluations arrived. The family gathered, not in Liam O'Connell's sterile conference room, but in the back office of the Harbor Light. The musty scent of old books had become, for Michael and Sarah, the smell of hard-won success. Elizabeth had flown in from Malawi, her skin tanned and her handshake firm. Jason stood a little taller, his gaze steady and direct. Dr. Eris, the trust-appointed psychiatrist, was a woman with kind eyes and a disarming smile. She didn't interrogate them. She simply asked them to talk about their year. Michael spoke first, his voice measured but earnest. He talked about the bookstore, about learning the value of community over pure profit, about the poetry book and the look on the woman's face. "I thought my mother was punishing me," he said. "She was trying to teach me that there are ledgers that can't be measured in dollars." Sarah spoke of her own journey from sentimentality to savvy, of learning that passion needed a business plan to survive. I was hiding behind the idea of soul, she admitted. Michael taught me that structure gives soul a place to live. Elizabeth's testimony was the most startling. She spoke not of hardship, but of grace. She talked about Joseph, about the children, about the profound humility of useful work. I built a school, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But it built me too. I was entitled. I believed the world owed me something. I now understand that I owe the world my effort. Jason was the last. He didn't have spreadsheets or construction projects to point to. He simply opened his journal and read the story of Leo, the pianist. The room fell silent. When he finished, the raw humanity in his words was a more powerful testament to his transformation than any argument could have been. Dr. Eris smiled, closing her own notebook. I don't think I need to render a formal diagnosis for entitlement disorder, she said. The cure appears to have been successfully administered. Liam O'Connell, who had been observing quietly, stepped forward. He placed a single document on the desk. It was the formal release of the trust. The conditions have been met, he said simply. The estate is yours. There was no cheering, no greedy scramble. There was only a deep, collective silence. The money, the object of their desire for so long, had suddenly lost its power over them. They had already received their inheritance. Michael looked around the small, cluttered office, at his sister's tired but proud face, at his other sister, transformed, at his nephew, grown into a man. He thought of the ledger his mother had left for them, not of finances, but of character. They had, against all odds, balanced it. The harbor light turns a profit now, Sarah said softly, breaking the silence. A small one. But it's ours. Maybe, Michael said, a new, unfamiliar idea taking root. We don't have to close it. Elizabeth nodded. The foundation could use a stateside partner for fundraising events. Jason looked up from his journal. I could write about it. They weren't just a family bound by blood and a shared trauma anymore. They were partners. They were a team. Maggie Delaney's final masterful clause had not just saved their souls. It had, impossibly, given them back to each other. The legacy. The transfer of the Delaney fortune was the quietest, most anticlimactic multi-million-dollar transaction in the history of Boston high society. There was no press release, no lavish party. Michael, Sarah, and Elizabeth simply signed the papers in Liam O'Connell's office, their demeanors reflective rather than triumphant. The fight had gone out of them, replaced by a steady, purposeful calm. The money, once an obsession, was now a tool. And each of them had a very different workshop. Michael did not return to corporate law. The cutthroat world he had once thrived in now felt hollow and predatory. Instead, he used his share to become a full-time partner in the Harbor Light. He and Sarah bought the building that housed the store, securing its future permanently. Michael found his new calling in mentoring small business owners in Rockport, offering pro bono legal and financial advice. He became known not as a ruthless lawyer, but as the quiet, knowledgeable man in the bookstore who could help you navigate a loan or a lease. The satisfaction he derived from a local artisan's success dwarfed any victory he'd ever won in a courtroom. Sarah, finally freed from the financial anxiety that had plagued her marriage, discovered a latent talent for curation and community building. She expanded the bookstore's events, turning it into a true cultural hub. She started a small, non-profit imprint to publish local authors. The twee little fantasies Michael had once mocked were now the heart of a thriving, sustainable enterprise. Her relationship with her husband, Tim, deepened, no longer strained by secret debts and unspoken resentments. For the first time, she was loved for what she built, not for what she could extract. Elizabeth returned to finance, but not to her old firm. She took a senior role at a prominent impact investing group, channeling her formidable intellect and ambition into funding renewable energy projects and microlending initiatives in developing countries. The Liz Foundation, managed with Michael's legal precision, continued its work, but now it was just one part of her life, not an anomaly. She was respected, even feared, but now for her vision, not her ruthlessness. She occasionally dated, but found she was no longer interested in the kind of power broker who had once been her type. She preferred the company of people who, like Joseph in Malawi, understood the value of building something that lasted. Jason used his inheritance to put himself through a prestigious MFA program in creative writing. The stories from his journal became the basis of his first collection, a critically acclaimed work that explored the invisible lives of ordinary people. He dedicated the book to Frank, the retired mechanic. He was still on social media, but now it was a tool to promote his work and connect with readers, not a validation cage. He was, at last, the author of his own life. They were not a perfect family. Old habits and irritations sometimes resurfaced. Sarah could still be overly sentimental, Michael overly pragmatic, and Elizabeth overly blunt. But the venom was gone. The arguments were now followed by compromise, not cold wars. Once a month, they gathered for dinner. Sometimes it was at Michael's modern apartment, sometimes at Sarah's comfortably cluttered home, sometimes at a restaurant Elizabeth chose for its innovative cuisine. The conversation was no longer about dividends and assets, but about plot holes in the novels Sarah was championing, the challenges of a new green tech startup Elizabeth was evaluating, or the latest chapter of Jason's manuscript. On the 5th anniversary of Maggie's passing, they gathered at the Back Bay house, which Michael now owned and had preserved exactly as their mother had left it. They sat in the living room, the grandfather clock still ticking faithfully. "It's strange," Sarah said, sipping her wine. "I don't miss the money. Miss her. The real her. The her before we became what we became. We gave her no reason to be that person," Elizabeth replied, her voice soft. "We only saw the wallet." Jason, who had been quietly looking at a family photo album, pointed to a picture of a much younger Maggie, laughing, her arms around a teenage Michael and a pigtailed Sarah. "She looks happy here." "That was before Dad died," Michael said. "Before the money became a burden. She was trying to hold us all together with it. And it took her dying and playing the most brutal game of psychological chess in history to finally make it work," Elizabeth added with a wry smile. They fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts of the formidable, complicated woman who had loved them enough to force them to change. The true legacy of Margaret Delaney was not the $78 million. It was the bookstore in Maine, a beacon for a community. It was the clean water projects in rural Malawi. It was the book of stories giving voice to the unseen. It was the monthly family dinners, filled with easy laughter and unwavering support. She had used her last act not to grant an inheritance, but to force her family to build one for themselves. And in the end they had. It was a legacy not of wealth, but of character. A legacy written not in a will, but in the redeemed lives of her children. The grandfather clock chimed, its sound no longer a countdown, but a gentle marker of time well spent. The Delaney family was finally, and truly, home. If you enjoyed my story and would like to help me create more, your support through a small donation would mean the world to me. Thank you so much in advance. Now, tell me, what would you have done in this person's place? I'd really love to hear your thoughts, so please share them in the comments below. I'm always eager to know your perspectives and where you first discovered this story. If you'd like to hear more real-life stories like this one, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. There are many more waiting for you. With warm regards, Ent.